What's up YouTube? Have you ever wondered how the tools inside of InDesign compare to the tools in Affinity Publisher? Well, that is what we are here to talk about today. Alright, so this is the third video in this series comparing Adobe's tools to Affinity's tools. And the main gripe that people in the comments have had with these videos is that I don't explore every aspect of every single program. But that has never been the point of these videos. The point of these videos is to look at the tools along the left-hand side and see how they compare. Where I can, I do like to mention if a feature is duplicated in the other program, just not in the tools section. So I do try and mention those, but the point of these videos has never been to be a comprehensive review of each and entire program. That would just take way too long for the length of videos that we're going for. These videos are already quite lengthy for you to watch through. In this video, it gets even more complicated because these desktop publishing apps, which are what InDesign and Affinity Publisher are, they are very, very complex, and there is so much going on in the panels and studios on the right hand side and in the menus up at the top. There are so many features that are beyond the tools of these programs. But the point of this video is just to look at those tools along the left hand side and compare them. Now, before we get into it, I just want to say these are the most difficult pair of programs to compare because even though they are both desktop publishing apps, they really are very, very different. InDesign is a robust program that's been refined over decades for a publishing industry that is very slow to change. And there are many features that are in InDesign that Affinity Publisher has just not even come close to catching up to. And you can look in my Affinity Publisher videos in the comments to see real printers and publishers commenting on the features that they just don't have that they need. On the other hand, Affinity Publisher is leaps and bounds ahead of InDesign in terms of creating design documents and being able to use design tools. This is primarily because of the Studio link inside of Affinity Publisher that allows you to use the tools of Affinity Photo and Affinity Designer within that application. Now, we're not going to look at any of those extra tools that come from the Photo and Designer personas today because we are just comparing Affinity Publisher and Adobe InDesign's tools. So we're just going to look at what you can get with Affinity Publisher right out of the box. But I just wanted to clarify that. These programs are hard to compare to each other. And if you are thinking about buying either one of them, you should use the free trial and test out your workflow in them. And don't just rely on what I say in this video about the tools. The other thing that really helps Affinity Publisher is the speed at which it runs. It is so much faster than Adobe InDesign. In fact, Adobe InDesign really bogs down my computer. Now, you might remember last week I talked about how I'm thinking about buying a new iMac. I have put in a pre-order for one of those new iMacs, but I don't rely on InDesign very heavily at all. I use Affinity Publisher for almost everything, and so that's not a big deal to me. So let's go ahead and jump on the computer and look at Affinity Publisher and Adobe InDesign's tools. Well, my friends, I have some bad news. It turned out that InDesign was running so terribly and bogging down my computer so bad that I couldn't do a screencast looking at each of the tools. It just couldn't handle running InDesign with Affinity Publisher and recording the screen all at the same time. So unlike my other videos, I'm not going to be able to actually show you, but what I do have is a list of all the tools and I'm going to tell you about them. And I'll try and throw up some screenshots that show you which tools I'm talking about for your reference. And that's just the truth of what it's like dealing with InDesign on a day-to-day basis. I wasn't trying to open any large files. On an older computer like mine, it just runs really slowly. And when you try and run multiple programs, it's just hard to keep it running, even when you aren't working on large documents like books or magazines. When you are working on one of those with a lot of images in it, it of course bogs it down even further. So let's go ahead, let's take a look at this list and I'll read off to you what's what. And this might actually speed up the video a little bit. So first up is the selection tool in InDesign, and that is the same as the move tool in Affinity Publisher. This is one of your bread and butter tools, that arrow at the top. You use it to select things and move things around and adjust them. A tool like this is present in every Adobe program and every Affinity program. Next, we have the direct selection tool in InDesign, which is also the node tool in Affinity Publisher. These work very similarly. They allow you to select individual points in any kind of a vector object. Next up, there's the page tool. The page tool is a tool that actually allows you to adjust the page size in Adobe InDesign, and there is no tool like that in Affinity Publisher. Then there's the gap tool. This allows you to actually change the gaps of things like columns inside of InDesign, and there is no tool like that in Affinity Publisher. Next, there's a set of tools called the Content Collector and the Content Placer tool. This allows you to pick up content and then place it other places on the page. There's no tool like that in Affinity Publisher. So you can already see that we're seeing something very similar to what we've seen with Illustrator, in that there are a lot more tools in InDesign that have grown up over the history of the program. They may be useful, they may not be useful depending on your workflow, but there are a lot more tools here in InDesign. Next we come to a very important tool, which is the type tool. InDesign and Affinity Publisher as desktop publishing apps work a lot with text, and so of course they both have tools that can lay down type. The frame text tool is the equivalent of the type tool in Affinity Publisher. There's also a tool in InDesign called the type on a path tool. Now there isn't a tool exactly like this in Affinity Publisher, but the artistic text tool allows you to select a path and then type on it. So you can achieve the same functionality with the artistic text tool. Then we come to the line tool. This is just for drawing lines in InDesign, and that tool does not exist in Affinity Publisher. It's kind of subsumed into the pen tool. The pen tool is what you use to draw lines instead of having a separate line tool. Which brings us next to the pen tool. The pen tool is present in both programs, and it works very similarly in each program. You use it to lay down vector nodes in order to draw vector objects. Now there are a whole bunch of sub-tools within InDesign, just as there are in Adobe Illustrator for the pen tool, like add an anchor point and delete an anchor point. These features are present inside the pen tool in Affinity Publisher, but they are not separate tools. Next, we have the pencil tool set. The pencil tool, the smooth tool, and the eraser tool. These are for freehand type drawing, and there is nothing like this present in Affinity Publisher within the core set of tools. It's only when you actually add in the features of Affinity Designer through Studio Link that you're able to get something like this. Continuing down, we come to the frame tools. These are shapes that feature frames so that you can insert content into them. There are frame tools in Affinity Publisher. There's only a rectangle and an ellipse frame tool, not a polygon frame tool. That being said though, you can use any shape in Affinity Publisher as a frame for an image or other content using clipping masks. So it's still achievable, it's just a little bit different how you get there. Speaking of shapes, next we come to the shape tools in each program. Now, just as in the other programs that we've looked at, Affinity far and away blows away the Adobe programs when it comes to shapes. There are just way more shape options here out of the gate. So while you can create any shape using simple shapes and Boolean operations, you don't have as many shapes out of the gate just to play with in Adobe as you do in Affinity. And that's one of the things that a lot of people like about Affinity, is having all those pre-made shapes just ready to go. Next is the scissor tool, which allows you to separate points in InDesign. It allows you to say, I want this point to become 2 broken points so that I can move these lines independently of each other. While there is no scissor tool in Affinity Publisher, a feature is included in the node selection tool. So you are still able to split points. Next, we have the transform set of tools, which includes the free transform tool, as well as the rotate, scale, and shear tools. These tools do not exist in Affinity Publisher, but features like these are present in the transform panel when you are using the move tool. So you can select an object with the move tool and then use the transform panel to do things like transform, rotate, shear. Those types of things can all be done within the Transform Studio. Then in InDesign, we have the gradient tool. This is very similar to the fill tool in Affinity Publisher, which allows you to create gradient fills. These tools are very similar. Some people like one better than the other. A lot of people tend to find that Affinity's version of this is a lot more intuitive and easy to use, but they both do essentially the same thing. Next, there's the gradient feather tool. This allows you to feather the gradient's opacity. And there's a tool very similar to this called the transparency tool in Affinity Publisher. They don't work exactly the same, but they achieve very similar results when dealing with transparency. The next is a tool that I've never used in InDesign, but it might be important if you are an editor, and that is the note tool. I'm assuming people use this tool to leave feedback on other people's InDesign documents, which seems like a very useful feature if you're working in a team. But again, it's not a tool that I've ever used, and it's not present in Affinity Publisher. Then we come to the color theme tool. The color theme tool is a super useful way to make color themes within Adobe InDesign, but it is not something that is present inside of Affinity Publisher. There's no equivalent. You just have to go and create your own swatches within the Color Studio. With the color theme tool, we also find the eyedropper tool. Now this allows you to go up and pick up color and other properties in InDesign. And there is a tool that looks like an eyedropper that's called the color picker tool in Affinity Publisher. These tools look very similar and they do similar things, but it's important to note that Adobe's version of this tool is much more robust than Affinity's version of this tool. It allows you to pick up a lot more properties, so while they look similar and do similar things, the one in InDesign is a lot more robust. We also have the Measure tool, which allows you to measure objects. There's nothing like that in Affinity Publisher. You just have to look in the Transform panel for the size measurements of the object that you're using. Then we have the Hand tool, which is used for panning around on the screen. This is called the View tool in Affinity Publisher, but it's the same tool and also uses the hand icon. And lastly, we have the Zoom tool. There's a Zoom tool that looks like a magnifying glass in both programs, which allows you to zoom, but I never ever use that tool because it is so much faster to use keyboard and mouse shortcuts to zoom. So I don't even know why that tool is still left around. So that wraps up the tools in Adobe InDesign. There are not as many tools here as there were in Adobe Illustrator, but you can see there are still more tools here than there are in Affinity Publisher. But there are a few tools that are in Affinity Publisher that are not present in Adobe InDesign, and I'm going to go over those now. The first one is the Table tool, which allows you to create tables. Now, of course, you can create tables through the menus in Adobe InDesign, so it's not like this feature isn't present there. There just isn't a tool for it in Adobe InDesign. Next, we mentioned before the Artistic Text tool. The Artistic Text tool allows you to create point text in Affinity Publisher, and in Adobe InDesign, there is no equivalent to the Artistic Text tool. Of course, as we mentioned before, there are many different shape tools in Affinity Publisher and indeed in all the Affinity programs. So there's just a whole lot more than the basic shapes that you get in Adobe InDesign. There's also a tool called the Image Place tool. Now, Adobe InDesign can obviously place images, and Command D is probably one of the most common commands used in InDesign in order to place images and documents. But there isn't a tool for it. Whereas in Affinity Publisher, there's specifically a tool for placing images. Next, we have the Data Merge tool. Now, Data Merge is a feature that is in InDesign, but there isn't a tool for it in InDesign, whereas there is a tool on the left-hand side for it in the latest version of Affinity Publisher. This is one of the features of Affinity Publisher to have just recently been released with Affinity 1.9. And lastly, we have the Vector Crop tool. This allows you to crop any object using a vector-based crop tool. Now, this is very similar to what InDesign automatically does, using the frame and image system where the frame will crop in on the image. This feature is really useful, but also very frustrating for new users of InDesign. And so it's kind of nice that in Affinity Publisher, there's a separate tool just to handle that kind of cropping, and that it's useful for objects as well as for photos. All right, and that wraps up these lists of tools. These two programs, like I said before, they are very different. And so I want to hear from you in the comments. Which tools are absolute deal breakers for you? Do you have to have? And what are you using Affinity Publisher or Adobe InDesign for? I'm very excited to hear what you have to say about this topic. I think it's really interesting that even though they're called InDesign and Affinity Publisher, it really feels like InDesign is aimed at publishers, and Affinity Publisher is actually aimed more at designers with the types of toolset and workflow that they have. And if you'd like to hear more about that in another video, let me know in the comments below if you'd like me to talk more about how these desktop publishing programs seem to be aimed at different types of users. I'm really sorry about things not working out with the screencast for this video. I hope you've still been able to enjoy and learn something. We'll chat in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.